trying to find the ideal one. One of the things I ended up settling on a number of years ago was an Able Super 5 on my 7-way. And the reason for it was it didn't sand up that badly. Some of the reels I've had, they get the clearance on the spool between the rim would bind up sand, and then all of a sudden it'd be grinding. And so, and that reel seemed to be pretty bulletproof. I've slipped on some rocks. I've busted the handle off. I've scraped off the anodizing in certain spots, but it still goes. You just have to take care of the drag bearings on those reels. They tend to get a little rusty if you don't spray them. I've had to replace those a couple times because they're kind of small. But otherwise, I mean, parts are available, and it's an easy reel to service on your own. Except when the bearings fail, then you have to send it back. But it's been a pretty bulletproof reel for me. Lines I use basically I like the striper lines, the Rio striper lines. I use those, the 350 on my 7-weight. I really like that line. It's smooth and it shoots well, and I don't have to mess around with any other connections. I would tend to recommend probably cutting the welds off at times. I've had those lines fail on the welds on the loop ends. You just tie your own. Basically, nail a lot of them over and make a loop. I do loop-to-loop connections on everything from the backing to the leader. And basically fish on the terminal tackle. I guess we can go into that later. But that's the basis for the gear I use.
Fishing the Huntington Beach area, I think personally an 8-weight rod is going to be a better way to go. Fishing up in the Long Beach area, because we don't really have much surf up there, you can get away with a 6-weight rod. I think every beach is going to vary between an intermediate sink line, a floating line, a shooting head. Long Beach area specifically, you can get away with using a floating line. There's no surf up in that area. You may get a bit of a surge. Huntington Beach, again, 300 grain, 200 grain line, depending on the size of the surf. As far as reels, I think a great reel to start off is a Lamson reel. It's got a closed conical drag system. You're not going to get any sand inside it. You know, there's 100 different reels out on the market right now, but I think the sand is a critical part in doing any surf fishing.
This is actually a really good topic to talk about rods and reels. Because now, believe it or not, 10 years ago, they made rods for the saltwater, but they weren't really thinking of the surf per se. Now they will actually make a rod just for what we do on the coast here. 6-weights were not common to use in the saltwater even 10 or 15 years ago. Now guys are taking their 6-weights out, but they do make 6-weights that are made for what we do, and they're beefier versions. So grabbing your trout 6-weight is a great way to go, but I encourage you to use something that has a little more of a layup, we call it. This is a graphite rod here, but in a 6-weight, they give a little more graphite to the butt section. They're now having bigger stripping guides, and they might have 2 stripping guides, so that lets you shoot line better, because now you have 40 feet of line shooting on your basket. Also, trout rods tend to have what's called a half-Wells grip, so it tapers toward the front. And so rods that are built with what's called a full Wells grip like this work better. We're now moving lines that are shooting heads. There's a lot of mass. We're throwing bigger flies. And those massive lines and flies we're throwing require us to be more vigorous on the rod. This handle works better. Plus, when you're fighting fish, this is easier to hold. Guys with larger hands like this. Also, rods that have an anodized reel seat hold up a lot better on the salt. A lot of your trout rods might have like nickel silver on them, and they'll last in the salt just fine, but you have to clean them up. Otherwise, they'll start greening out. So if you're getting into the salt, start out with something you have, but if you like doing it, purchase a rod that's going to fit your fishery based on what you're doing, and purchase something that's going to hold up in the wind and all the other things that you find on the coast. Yeah. And if you notice, you can't really see this, but we'll pass this around. The guides on this are almost, I don't know, maybe 20% bigger. That allows you to move more line. Trout fishing, everything's from me to the doorway here. In saltwater fishing, I'm going back to the back of the room, so the guides have to accommodate more speed, more distance, things like that. Reels, again, find something that's anodized so it stands up in the salt, and also a closed system in terms of your drag. So some drags let water in and out, which is fine, but salt going in and out of your drag system doesn't work very well for very long. sand gets into everything, so a closed drag system is the best way to go bar none.
How do you clean your reel?
You know, I'm really hard on my gear, and I tend to test for a lot of very different companies, so I will point my hose at it, and that's it. But if it's my personal stuff, and I'm not testing, I go home, I take it apart, I look at it, it's good. I don't get into the drag because it has a seal drag, so that's how I do it. Fly lines, believe it or not, 10 years ago, there wasn't a real striper line. There wasn't a line for the surf. There weren't lines to actually do what we did 6 or 7 years ago. 2 brands came out with lines that are built for what we do, so people getting into the surf now, it's so much easier. You can't even believe it. I was making fly line for guys when they come in the shop. They'd be like, oh, you want to get surf fishing? Okay, come back in an hour. And the guy would look at me like, what's going on? I said, well, I have to build your line. And we'd marry a shooting head to a running line. So it's a lot easier to do, and make sure to match your line to the rod. Have a shop or one of the staff guys here help you out.
Excuse me, what's different about the striper line than some of these other lines that are available? I mean, why? Because you've said it, someone else has said it.
Yeah, the striper lines were one of the first ones. So the striper lines were one of the first ones to come out with that. So that striper line was actually built for a much larger fishery. It wasn't built for the West Coast per se, but it was built for striper fishery, which is an East Coast fishery predominantly. And they've been doing saltwater fishing for 40 years before we even started. So the line is a 26-foot sink tip. It allows the caster to pick up a head and make a very easy cast right away. There are shooting heads now that are 35 feet long. I don't recommend those for people getting started in the surf. They're longer heads, they're harder to roll cast out of the water. You had 6, and now you have 6 feet of leader with a heavy cloud, and that's hard to get out. So a real striper line has a 26-foot head. It's easy to get out of the water right away, and it's easy to manhandle from the get-go. So for a consumer, that's the best way to go.
Isn't it density compensated too?
It's also density compensated, yeah. And now that line has a line behind it that syncs with it. There are shooting heads out there, or heads, or sink tips, that are set up with floating running lines, and I don't recommend the floating running lines in the surf for what we do down south. Some of the anglers I fish with like a floating running line, but they're fishing surf that's this big, so it's not critical that they keep their line below it. So based on your fishery, what you do, you might want to dial that in with someone like a staff member, or just come talk to me afterwards, or we can help dial it in. Make sense?
Are there people who use switch and spade rods?
There are,
in the surf?
and they're extremely versatile. I'm a big spade guy. I love steelhead fishing. My spade stuff stays out of the salt. I love to fish it off the jays. I can launch it a mile. I find that they tend to get in the way. It's just more rod than I need. Most of my fishing occurs from here to the back door there, which is, what is that, 65 feet, guys? That's a comfortable distance to cast, and you can manage line there. So what I found when I used a spade or switch rod, I got a lot more distance, but it seemed like there was so much line coming out of the basket, it would tangle more frequently. There's a critical mass of running line you can shoot from a basket, and it's not as much as you think. Unless you have a basket that's like the size of a laundry basket, which I've seen guys use, and you can shoot almost a full fly line from that. But what I find is if I'm shooting a running line with a spade rod, I can't get enough line in that basket to make it easy for me, because I can shoot 120 feet long. So I would encourage you to start with a single hand rod, get comfortable there, and then as you get more comfortable, try a switch rod, because it's a little bit shorter. But spade rods didn't work for me necessarily. Make sense? Okay.
What about the 10-foot rods?
10-foot rods are great. I love them. Like a 9.5-foot rod, as long as they're quick enough for you. What happens is anglers cast a rod that's 9 feet and it's very quick, but as soon as you add another foot of graphite, that rod softens up a little bit more, so their timing changes,